His crown came with a warning. Serafina Mancini had spent her life being the perfect mafia wife, silent, beautiful, untouchable. But when her husband was murdered, she realized something dangerous. She was more powerful alone. The only man who saw it was Luca Romano, the one who had always watched her from the shadows. He stepped closer, his voice dark, knowing. "Tell me, Regina," he murmured, "are you here to grieve, or to take his place?" Chapter 1. The scent of gunpowder and lilies. The air in the grand hall was thick, a suffocating blend of expensive perfume, the lingering tang of gunpowder, and the cloying sweetness of lilies. Serafina Mancini stood amidst the throng of mourners, a statue carved from ice and grief, her black silk dress a stark contrast to the paleness of her skin. Her husband, Don Antonio Mancini, lay in the open casket, his face serene, almost peaceful, a stark lie compared to the violence that had ripped him from this world, from her. She felt the eyes on her, assessing, judging, calculating. The vultures were already circling, the underbosses and capos of the Mancini family, their wives draped in black lace, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves, carrying secrets and ambitions. They expected her to crumble, to fade into the background, to become a ghost in her own palazzo. That was the way of things. A widow, especially a mafia widow, was a fragile thing, a liability. Serafina's fingers, adorned with the heavy Mancini family ring, a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg, surrounded by diamonds clenched subtly. She had worn the ring for 30 years, a symbol of her marriage, of her place. Now it felt like a brand, a shackle. But beneath the grief, a flicker of something else, something unfamiliar, was stirring. Defiance. Luca Romano stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a marble pillar, his dark eyes fixed on Serafina. He was a shadow, always present, always observing. He wasn't family, not in the traditional sense, but he was Antonio's most trusted confidant, his consigliere, the keeper of secrets. He was also the only man who had ever truly seen her, not as the Don's wife, but as Serafina. He was a study in contrasts. Sharp, tailored suit, the color of midnight, a stark counterpoint to the ruggedness of his features. A face that could have been carved from granite, a jawline that spoke of unwavering resolve, and eyes that held both a chilling intensity and a surprising depth of understanding. He was handsome, undeniably so, but in a way that was dangerous, untamed. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator's elegance, that both intimidated and intrigued. Serafina remembered the first time she had seen him, a lifetime ago. She had been a young bride, barely out of her teens, thrust into a world of power and violence she barely understood. He had been a young man then, too, but already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had watched her, silently, across the crowded room, his gaze lingering a moment too long, a spark of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. It had both frightened and thrilled her. Over the years, their interactions had been limited, formal. He was always respectful, deferential, addressing her as Signora Mancini, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine, shivers she tried to ignore. But there were moments, fleeting glances, a brush of his hand against hers as he helped her from a car, a shared look of understanding across a crowded room that hinted at something more, something unspoken. Now, as she met his gaze across the hall, the unspoken was palpable. The air crackled with it. He didn't offer condolences, didn't utter empty platitudes. He simply held her gaze, a silent question hanging between them. The priest's voice droned on, reciting the familiar prayers, the Latin words washing over Serafina, meaningless. She felt detached, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief, yes, but also a strange sense of liberation, a terrifying freedom. Antonio had been a powerful man, a controlling man. He had loved her in his own way, but his love had been a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. She had learned to play the role of the perfect mafia wife. Silent, obedient, beautiful. She had learned to hide her intelligence, her wit, her strength. She had learned to be a shadow, to exist only in Antonio's reflection. But now, the shadow was gone, and she was left standing in the harsh glare of the spotlight, exposed, vulnerable, and yet powerful. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she swayed slightly. Luca was instantly at her side, his hand steadying her arm. His touch was electric, sending a jolt through her, a reminder that she was alive, that she was feeling. "Signora," he murmured, his voice low, for her ears only. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, her eyes, the color of deep sea green, filled with a mixture of grief and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He led her away from the crowd, towards a small, secluded alcove overlooking the gardens. The scent of roses and jasmine, heavy and sweet, mingled with the ever-present smell of the city, a reminder of the life that continued, even in the face of death. "He is gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper, stating the obvious, the undeniable truth that hung heavy in the air. Luca nodded, his gaze unwavering. "He is." She looked out at the gardens, the meticulously manicured lawns, the fountains splashing gently in the twilight. It was a beautiful prison, she realized. And she was no longer sure she wanted to be a prisoner. "They expect me to disappear," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "To become a recluse, a shadow." Luca's lips curved in a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Do they?" "What else would they expect?" Serafina challenged, a spark of the old fire returning to her eyes. "I am a woman, a widow. My purpose was to be his wife." He turned to face her, his dark eyes boring into hers. "And is that what you believe, Serafina?" He used her given name, a subtle shift, a crossing of a boundary. It sent another shiver down her spine, this one not entirely unpleasant. She hesitated, the question hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She had never allowed herself to truly consider what she believed, what she wanted. Her life had been dictated by duty, by tradition, by Antonio. She began, but the words caught in her throat. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space, his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, more primal, enveloping her. He reached out, his hand hovering just above her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a tremor through her. "Tell me, Regina," he murmured, his voice dark, knowing, the word queen spoken with a reverence that was both unsettling and intoxicating. "Are you here to grieve, or to take his place?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, an invitation, a threat. The scent of lilies seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp, undeniable scent of danger. And for the first time in a long time, Serafina Mancini felt a flicker of something other than grief. She felt alive. She looked into the eyes of the man, the only one to ever see behind her mask, and was unsure whether to run or find answers. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Palazzo. The days following the funeral were a blur of hushed conversations, veiled threats, and the constant, suffocating presence of tradition. The Palazzo, once Antonio's domain, now felt like a gilded cage closing in on Serafina. Every portrait, every antique, every meticulously arranged flower arrangement was a reminder of her loss, and of the life she was expected to continue living, a life of quiet mourning, of subservient acceptance. The whispers followed her everywhere. The servants, the guards, even the family members who came to pay their respects, they all spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting towards her, then away, as if afraid to meet her gaze directly. They spoke of Antonio's legacy, of the need for stability, of the importance of maintaining the famiglia's power. They spoke of her role, a role she was no longer sure she wanted to play. Luca was a constant presence, a silent guardian, his watchful eyes missing nothing. He navigated the treacherous currents of the Mancini family with an ease born of years of experience, deflecting questions, parrying threats, and subtly, always subtly, protecting Serafina. He spoke little, but his presence was a reassurance, a silent promise of support in a world that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with Antonio's underbosses, a group of men who clearly saw her as a temporary inconvenience, a placeholder until they could consolidate their own power, Serafina found herself alone in Antonio's study. It was a room she had rarely entered during his lifetime, a sanctuary of masculine power, filled with dark wood furniture, leather-bound books, and the ever-present scent of cigars and expensive whiskey. She ran her hand over the smooth surface of his desk, a massive mahogany behemoth that dominated the room. It was here that he had made his decisions, here that he had wielded his power, here that he had sealed the fates of men. Now it was empty, a silent testament to his absence. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she sank into his chair, the leather creaking beneath her weight. The room seemed to spin, the portraits of his ancestors on the walls seeming to stare down at her, judging her, questioning her right to be here. She closed her eyes, trying to regain her composure, trying to find some semblance of the strength she had felt in the days after his death, the flicker of defiance that had dared to challenge the established order. But it was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, a sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of her situation. A soft knock on the door startled her. Luca entered, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silence. "They are pushing you," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on her. Serafina nodded, her throat tight. "They want me to step aside, to let them handle things." "And what do you want, Serafina?" The question, simple yet profound, hung in the air. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I did," but now he moved closer, his presence filling the room, his scent a comforting anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He knelt beside her chair, his hand resting on the armrest, inches from hers. "You are stronger than you think," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very being. "You have always been strong. You just haven't had the chance to show it." She looked at his hand, so close to hers, the contrast of his dark skin against the pale leather. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to feel the reassurance of his presence, but she hesitated, a lifetime of ingrained restraint holding her back. "Antonio," he would have wanted she began, but the words trailed off, meaningless. Luca's hand covered hers, his touch surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of warmth through her. "Antonio is gone," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "You must think of yourself now, of what you want." His touch, the warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, broke through the wall of grief and exhaustion that had surrounded her. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, the first she had shed since the funeral. He reached up, his thumb brushing away the tear, his touch sending another shiver through her. "Don't cry, Regina," he murmured. "Tears are for the weak. And you are anything but weak." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite define. Fear, perhaps, but also attraction. A dangerous, forbidden attraction that she had suppressed for years, an attraction that was now, in the wake of Antonio's death, threatening to consume her. "What am I going to do, Luca?" she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. He held her gaze, his eyes dark and unfathomable. "You are going to survive," he said, his voice a promise. "And you're going to thrive. I will make sure of it." He stood up, pulling her with him, his hands lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. "They underestimate you," he said, his voice turning hard, a hint of steel beneath the velvet. "They see a grieving widow, a fragile woman. They do not see the fire that burns within you. They do not see the queen." He turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that both frightened and exhilarated her. "But I see it, Serafina. I have always seen it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I will help you show them. If that is what you want." The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The whispers of the palazzo seemed to fade, replaced by the beating of her own heart, a frantic rhythm that echoed the uncertainty and the undeniable thrill of the path that lay before her. The choice, she suddenly understood, was hers and hers alone. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Ruby Ring. The ruby ring, Antonio's ring, fell heavier than ever on Serafina's finger. It was a symbol of power, of belonging, of a life she was no longer sure she recognized. She twisted it, the facets of the stone catching the light, throwing off flashes of red that seemed to mirror the turmoil within her. She was sitting in the small, private garden behind the palazzo, a secluded oasis of calm amidst the storm that was brewing within the Mancini family. The scent of roses and jasmine was heavy in the air, a bittersweet reminder of happier times, of a life before the scent of gunpowder had become a constant companion. Luca had arranged for a small table to be set up, with a simple breakfast of fresh fruit, pastries, and strong coffee. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that both unnerved and intrigued her. "You haven't eaten," he observed, his voice a low rumble. Serafina pushed the food around on her plate, her appetite non-existent. "I'm not hungry." He raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. "You need to keep your strength up. They will try to wear you down, to break you." She met his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I won't break." He smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "I know you won't." There was a silence, broken only by the chirping of birds and the gentle splashing of the fountain. Serafina continued to twist the ring, her mind racing. "They want me to sign the papers," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "To transfer control of Antonio's assets to them." Luca nodded, his expression unchanging. "I know. They think I'm a fool," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "That I don't understand what they're doing." "And are you?" She looked up at him, her eyes flashing. "No. I may have played the part of the obedient wife, but I was not blind. I saw, I heard, I learned." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then you know what is at stake." She nodded. "Everything. Antonio's legacy, the famiglia, my own future." "And more than that," Lucas said, his voice turning hard. "There are secrets that Antonio entrusted to me. Things that they cannot know. Things that could destroy them all." Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She had always suspected that there was more to Antonio's business than she knew, that there were layers of darkness beneath the surface of wealth and power. "What kind of secrets?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Luca hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Secrets that could bring down the entire family," he said, his voice low and grave. "Secrets that could start a war." "A war." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Serafina felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of the morning sun. "And you know these secrets?" she asked.
Luca nodded.
"Antonio trusted me. He told me everything."
"Why?"
she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Why you and not me?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions: regret, understanding, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Because he knew that you were strong," he said, his voice soft. "But he also knew that you were untouched by the darkness. He wanted to protect you from it." "Protect me?" Serafina scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He kept me a prisoner in a gilded cage. He controlled every aspect of my life." "He loved you," Lucas said, his voice firm. "In his own way. And is that enough?" she challenged, her eyes flashing. "Is that an excuse for everything?" He didn't answer, his gaze holding hers. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Serafina looked down at the ring on her finger, the weight of it pressing down on her. It was a symbol of her past, of a life she could no longer go back to. But it was also a symbol of power, a power she was only beginning to understand. "What do you want me to do, Luca?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want you to think," he said, "to consider your options, to decide what you want, not what they expect of you. And If what I want is to fight? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed his face. Then I will fight with you, he said, his voice a promise. Every step of the way. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. The ruby ring pressed into her skin, a reminder of the weight of her decision, of the path that lay before her. A path fraught with danger, but also, perhaps, with the possibility of true freedom. A path that will decide where her life will go. Will she be chained again, or rise like a phoenix? Chapter 4. Shadows across the courtyard. The courtyard of the palazzo was usually a place of tranquility, a haven of manicured gardens and splashing fountains. But tonight it felt different. Shadows danced in the moonlight, cast by the ancient olive trees, twisting into menacing shapes that seemed to mirror the unease that had settled over Serafina. She stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, wrapped in a silk shawl, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. She couldn't sleep. The meeting with the lawyers earlier that day had left her shaken, the blatant greed and thinly veiled threats of Antonio's underbosses echoing in her mind. They had presented her with documents, a mountain of paperwork that would effectively strip her of all control, leaving her with a generous, but ultimately meaningless, allowance. She had refused to sign, of course. Her refusal had been met with icy stares and veiled warnings, their words dripping with the implicit threat of violence. They underestimated her, she knew. They saw her as a weak, grieving widow, easily manipulated. They did not see the steel that was slowly forging itself within her, tempered by grief and fueled by a growing sense of defiance. Luca had been there, a silent presence at her side, his very presence a deterrent to their more overt threats. He had said little, but his eyes had spoken volumes, a silent promise of protection, of support. Now, as she stood on the balcony, she felt his presence behind her, even before he spoke. "You should be inside," he said, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. She didn't turn. "I couldn't sleep." He moved closer, his warmth a welcome presence against the chill of the night. He stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "They are watching you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Waiting for you to make a mistake." Serafina nodded, her gaze fixed on the shadows below. "I know. They are also afraid of you," he continued. "They don't know what you will do." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his in the dim light. "And what will I do, Luca?" He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That is for you to decide." "You said you would help me," she reminded him, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "I will," he affirmed, his voice firm. "But I cannot make the decisions for you. You must choose your own path." She sighed, her breath misting in the cool air. "It's all so complicated." "It is the nature of power," he said, his voice turning hard. "It is a dangerous game, Serafina. And there are no easy answers." She looked back at the courtyard, her gaze drawn to a figure lurking in the shadows beneath one of the olive trees. It was one of the guards, one of Antonio's men, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was not there to protect her. He was there to watch her, to report back to the underbosses. "They don't trust me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't trust anyone," Luca corrected. "Especially not a woman who holds the keys to Antonio's kingdom." A woman. The word hung in the air, a reminder of the inherent prejudice she faced, the ingrained belief that a woman was incapable of wielding power, of making the hard decisions. "I will show them," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge. "I will show them that I am not just Antonio's widow. I am Serafina Mancini." Luca smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you will." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. He didn't linger, didn't cross the boundary, but the brief contact was enough to ignite a spark, a flicker of something forbidden, something dangerous. "Come inside," he said, his voice softening. "It's late.
And you need your rest."
She hesitated, torn between the desire to stay, to draw strength from his presence, and the need to be alone, to gather her thoughts, to prepare for the battle that lay ahead. "I will," she said finally. "In a moment." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer before he turned and walked back inside, leaving her alone with the shadows and the whispers of the night. Serafina remained on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the courtyard below. The figure beneath the olive tree was still there, a silent, watchful presence. She knew that she was being tested, that every move she made was being scrutinized. But she was no longer afraid. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by something else, something stronger. Determination. Resolve. A fierce, unwavering desire to protect what was hers, to honor Antonio's legacy, not by fading into the background, but by stepping into the light, by claiming her rightful place. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. The shadows still danced, but they no longer seemed so menacing. She was ready. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She would show them what a Mancini widow was truly capable of. The game, she sensed with both dread and elation, had begun. Chapter 5. A Dance with a Ghost. The ballroom of the palazzo was a vast, echoing space, filled with the ghosts of past celebrations, of lavish parties and whispered secrets. Tonight, it was empty, save for Serafina and the haunting strains of a lone violin. She had requested the music, a specific piece, a waltz that Antonio had loved, a melody that evoked memories of a time when her life had seemed simpler, less fraught with danger. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, letting it transport her back to a time when she had been simply Antonio's wife, not the keeper of his secrets, the inheritor of his power. She began to dance, her movements slow and graceful, her black dress swirling around her like a cloud of smoke. She danced with a ghost, with the memory of Antonio, his strong arms guiding her, his laughter echoing in her ears. But the ghost was fading, replaced by a growing awareness of her own strength, of her own power. She was not the fragile, grieving widow they expected her to be. She was a survivor, a fighter, a queen in her own right. And she was ready to claim her throne. A movement at the edge of her vision caught her eye. Luca stood in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was dressed in a dark suit, as always, his presence both comforting and unsettling. She stopped dancing, the music fading into silence. He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. "You dance beautifully," he said, his voice a low murmur. Serafina shrugged, a self-conscious gesture. It was a way to remember. "And to forget," he added, his eyes searching hers. She met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Perhaps." He stopped in front of her, his presence filling the space, his scent a familiar anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "They are meeting tonight," he said, his voice turning serious. "The underbosses. They are planning their next move." Serafina nodded, her heart beating faster.
I know.
"They will try to force your hand," he continued, "to make you sign the papers." "I won't sign," she said, her voice firm. "Not until I know everything." He smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "Good." There was a silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. Serafina looked around the ballroom, at the empty tables, the silent chandeliers, the ghosts of the past. "Antonio loved this room," she said, her voice soft. "He loved to entertain, to show off his power." "And you?" Luca asked, his eyes searching hers. "Did you love it?" She hesitated, her gaze drawn to a portrait of Antonio hanging on the wall, his eyes seeming to follow her. "I adapted," she said, finally. "I learned to play the role." "But it was just a role, wasn't it?" he said, his voice a low, insistent murmur. "It wasn't who you truly are." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and understanding. "I don't know who I truly am anymore, Luca," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. "You will," he said, his voice a promise. "You will find yourself again. and I will be here to help you. His touch lingered for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken attraction that simmered between them, an attraction that was both dangerous and exhilarating. "Tell me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Tell me what Antonio wanted me to know." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers.
"It's not a simple story," he said.
"It's a long and complicated one, filled with secrets and betrayals." "I have time," she said, her voice firm. "And I need to know. I need to understand what I'm fighting for." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "Very well," he said. "But not here. Not tonight.
Come with me."
He led her out of the ballroom, through the darkened corridors of the palazzo, towards a hidden room, a secret sanctuary that only he and Antonio had known. A room where the truth awaited her, a truth that would change everything. She went, unafraid, or at least pretending to be, to wherever this dark, quiet man was leading her. Chapter 6. The Price of Silence. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, hidden behind a false panel in Antonio's study. It was lit by a single, bare bulb, casting harsh shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, a testament to years of secrets kept hidden within these walls. There was a single table in the center of the room, covered with documents, files, and photographs. Luca gestured towards the table, his expression grim. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "Antonio's legacy. The truth behind the Mancini empire." Serafina approached the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sense of dread, a premonition that what she was about to learn would shatter her world, would destroy everything she thought she knew about her husband, about her life. Luca began to explain, his voice calm and measured, even as he revealed a world of corruption, violence, and betrayal that stretched back generations. He spoke of rival families, of blood feuds, of alliances forged and broken. He spoke of illegal businesses, of money laundering, of political influence bought and paid for. He showed her photographs, faces of men she recognized, men she had dined with, men who had smiled at her and offered their condolences. Men who were now, she realized, her enemies. He showed her documents, contracts, agreements, handwritten notes, all detailing the intricate web of Antonio's criminal enterprise. A web that she was now, by virtue of her marriage, inextricably tangled in. The most damning revelation was a series of letters, written in Antonio's own hand, detailing a long-standing affair with another woman, a woman from a rival family. A woman who had borne him a son. Serafina felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. The betrayal cut deeper than any of the other revelations, a personal wound inflicted by the man she had loved, the man she had trusted. He had a child? She whispered, her voice trembling. Luca nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of regret and understanding.
Assons.
He is about 20 years old now. Serafina sank into the chair beside the table, her legs no longer able to support her. She felt numb, disoriented, as if the world had shifted beneath her feet.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did he keep this from me?" "He wanted to protect you," Luca said, his voice soft. "He knew that this knowledge would hurt you." "Protect me?" Serafina scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He lied to me.
He betrayed me.
And now I have to deal with the consequences." Luca knelt beside her, his hand resting on her arm, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. "You are not alone, Serafina," he said, his voice firm. "I am here. I will help you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this, Luca?" she asked. "Why are you helping me? You could have sided with them." He held her gaze, his eyes dark and unfathomable. "Because I believe in you," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "I believe in your strength. And because I made a promise to Antonio." "A promise?" Serafina asked, her voice trembling.
Luca nodded.
He knew that he was living on borrowed time. He knew that his enemies were closing in. "He made me promise to protect you, to guide you, to help you take his place." Take his place. The words echoed in her mind, a daunting, terrifying prospect. She was not Antonio. She could not rule with his ruthlessness, his cold-blooded calculation. "I don't know if I can do this, Luca," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. He reached out, his thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "You can," he said, his voice a promise. "You are stronger than you think. And you're not alone." The price of silence, he knew without speaking it, was the life she knew. The price of speaking out was danger, on all sides. It seemed Antonio had put her in check, but she knew, somehow, that she would checkmate them all, even her dead husband. He stood up, pulling her with him, his hands lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. He looked around the room, at the documents, the photographs, the evidence of a lifetime of secrets. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "They will be looking for us." He led her out of the room, back into the darkness of the palazzo. The secrets were out, the truth revealed, and the game had truly begun. The price had been exacted. Chapter 7. Rain on the Via Veneto. The rain was coming down in sheets, a torrential downpour that mirrored the tempest raging inside Serafina. Rome, usually a city of vibrant life and ancient beauty, felt oppressive, its narrow streets and historic buildings seeming to close in on her. Luca had insisted on moving her, on getting her out of the palazzo. He had said it was too dangerous, that the underbosses were growing impatient, that they would not hesitate to use force to get what they wanted. He had brought her to a small, discreet apartment overlooking the Via Veneto, a place he had apparently kept for emergencies. It was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable, a stark contrast to the opulent grandeur of the palazzo. Serafina stood at the window, watching the rain lash against the glass, the city lights blurred and distorted. She felt lost, adrift, the weight of the revelations from the secret room pressing down on her. Luca was making calls, his voice low and urgent, speaking in rapid Italian that she couldn't quite follow. He was arranging for protection, she assumed, calling in favors, pulling strings. He was a man of resources, a man who knew how to navigate the shadows of the underworld. She turned away from the window, her gaze drawn to a small, framed photograph on the table. It was a picture of Luca and Antonio, taken years ago, when they were both younger. They were standing side by side, smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. They looked like friends, brothers. It was a side of Antonio she had never seen, a glimpse of a man she had never truly known. The man in the photograph was carefree, relaxed, a stark contrast to the cold, controlling man she had married. Luca finished his call, his expression grim. He walked towards her, his presence filling the small apartment. "They are moving faster than I anticipated," he said, his voice low. "They're planning to make their move tonight." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" "It means they are coming for you," he said, his voice blunt. "They want to force you to sign the papers. Or worse." Worse. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Serafina felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of anger. "They think they can intimidate me," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "They think they can just take what is mine." Luca smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Let them think that." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. "We have a plan," he said, his voice softening. "A way to counter their move." He explained his plan, a daring, risky gamble that involved exposing Antonio's secrets to the authorities, a move that could bring down the entire Mancini family, including herself. It was a scorched earth tactic, a way to destroy everything in order to save herself. "It's dangerous," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We could both end up in prison. Or worse." "It's the only way," he said, his voice firm. "The only way to stop them. The only way to protect you." Protect her. The words resonated with her. A reminder of his promise to Antonio, of his unwavering loyalty. But it was more than that, she realized. There was something else in his eyes, something deeper, something that spoke of a personal connection, a forbidden attraction that had simmered between them for years. "Why are you doing this, Luca?" she asked, her voice raw with emotion. Why are you risking everything for me? He held her gaze, his eyes dark and unfathomable. Because I care about you, Serafina, he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. More than you know. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The rain continued to lash against the window, the city lights blurred and distorted. But in that small, sparsely furnished apartment, something had shifted. The boundaries had blurred. The unspoken had been spoken. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her, his scent a comforting anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his touch sending a tremor through her. I won't let them hurt you, he said, his voice a promise. I swear it. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss that quickly deepened into something more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss born of fear and adrenaline, of forbidden desire and long-suppressed emotions. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, that bound them together in a dangerous alliance, a pact made in the face of overwhelming odds. The rain continued to fall, washing away the past, cleansing the present, and blurring the future. Tonight, everything was on the line. The rain seemed endless, the city holding its breath. Chapter 8. Letters from a Dead Man. The letters were old, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. They were love letters, passionate and poetic, filled with words of longing and desire. They were not written to Serafina. Luca had given them to her after their kiss. He had said that she needed to see them, to understand the full extent of Antonio's betrayal, to understand the forces that were now arrayed against her. She sat on the small sofa in the apartment, the letters spread out before her, the rain still drumming against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm that was brewing both inside and outside. The letters were written to Isabella Rossi, a name Serafina vaguely recognized. The Rossis were a rival family, one of the oldest and most powerful in Rome. Their feud with the Mancinis went back generations, a bloody history of violence and betrayal. And Antonio had been in love with a Rossi. He had fathered a child with her.
Asson.
Serafina felt a cold knot of anger tighten in her stomach. The betrayal cut deep, a personal wound inflicted by the man she had thought she knew, the man she had loved. But there was something else in the letters, something that disturbed her even more than the revelation of Antonio's infidelity. There were hints, subtle references to a plan, a conspiracy to merge the two families, to unite the Rossis and the Mancinis under a single banner. A plan that involved her. She read the letters again and again, searching for clues, trying to piece together the puzzle. It was clear that Antonio had intended to marry her, to solidify his power base, but his heart had always belonged to Isabella. And their son, Alessandro, was the key to their plan. He was to be the heir, the one who would unite the two families, who would rule over a new, more powerful empire. And Serafina was to be what? A pawn? A figurehead? A sacrifice? She crumpled one of the letters in her hand, her anger rising. She would not be used. She would not be manipulated. She would not be a pawn in their game. Luca entered the room, his expression grim. He had been on the phone again, making arrangements, preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. Have you read them? He asked, his voice low. Serafina nodded, her eyes flashing. He used me, she said, her voice trembling with rage. He used us both. Luca sighed, his gaze softening. He was a complicated man, Serafina. Driven by ambition, by power. And love? She asked, her voice bitter. Did he ever truly love me? Luca hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He cared for you, he said finally. In his own way. But his heart belonged to Isabella. Serafina looked down at the letters, at the evidence of Antonio's betrayal. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear of anger, of grief, of loss. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luca reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. We fight, he said, his voice firm. We expose his secrets. We destroy his plan. And we build something new, something better. Something better. The words echoed in her mind, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, with uncertainty. They will come for us, she said, her voice trembling. The Rossis. The underbosses. They will all want revenge. Lucas smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Let them come, he said. We will be ready. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his embrace a source of comfort and strength. He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of defiance, of determination, of a love that was blossoming amidst the ruins of the past. The letters from a dead man had revealed a truth that was both painful and liberating. They had exposed the lies, the betrayals, the secrets that had shaped her life. But they had also given her a purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to believe in something more. They set the course, lit the way, with paper and ink, for a future she could barely picture, but that she was now determined to create. Chapter 9. The Lioness Awakens. The meeting was held in a private dining room at a discreet restaurant in Trastevere, a place known for its quiet elegance and its unspoken code of silence. It was a neutral ground, a place where enemies could meet and negotiate, where deals could be struck and betrayals plotted. Serafina had chosen the location, a deliberate assertion of her power, a signal that she was not afraid, that she was not going to be intimidated. She arrived with Luca, his presence a silent warning to the men who were waiting for her. The underbosses were already there, seated around a large table, their faces grim, their eyes filled with suspicion and hostility. There was Marco Bellini, Antonio's second-in-command, a ruthless, ambitious man who clearly saw himself as the rightful heir to the Mancini empire. There was Giovanni Rossi, Isabella's brother, a cold, calculating man who represented the interests of the Rossi family. And there was Alessandro, Antonio's son, a young man who bore a striking resemblance to his father, but with his mother's eyes that held a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. Serafina met their gazes, her own expression unreadable. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a simple but elegant black dress that accentuated her figure, a subtle reminder of her femininity, of her power. She wore the Mancini ruby ring, its weight a constant reminder of her responsibility, of her heritage. She sat at the head of the table, Lucas standing behind her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a silent gesture of support and protection. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and measured, her Italian flawless. "I believe we have much to discuss." Marco Bellini scoffed, his eyes filled with disdain. "There is nothing to discuss, Signora Mancini. You will sign the papers. You will step aside, and we will take care of things." Serafina smiled, a slow, chilling smile that did not reach her eyes. "I think you misunderstand, Signor Bellini. I am not here to negotiate. I am here to inform you of my decision." Giovanni Rossi leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And what is that decision, Signora?" Serafina looked at each of them in turn, her eyes lingering on Alessandro, her husband's son, the young man who was supposed to be the heir to everything. "I will not sign your papers," she said, her voice firm. "I will not step aside. I will not be intimidated. I am Antonio Mancini's widow, and I will take my rightful place as the head of this family." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a declaration of war. The underbosses exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. Marco Bellini slammed his fist on the table, his face turning red. "You are a fool, woman. You have no idea what you are doing. You are playing with fire." Serafina met his gaze, her own eyes flashing. "Perhaps," she said, her voice dangerously low, "but I am not afraid of fire. I am, after all, a Mancini." She reached into her purse, pulling out a small, silver device, a recording device. She placed it on the table, in plain view of everyone. "I have been recording our conversation," she said, her voice calm. "And I have copies of all of Antonio's documents, his letters, his secrets. I have sent them to the authorities, to the newspapers, to everyone who needs to know." A gasp went around the table. The underbosses looked at each other, their faces paling. They had underestimated her. They had thought she was a weak, grieving widow, easily manipulated. They had not realized that she was a lioness, awakened and ready to defend her territory. "You are bluffing," Giovanni Rossi said, his voice trembling slightly. Serafina smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. "Am I? Do you want to take that chance?" She looked at Alessandro, her eyes softening slightly. "I know about your father's plan," she said. "About his arrangement with your mother. I know that he wanted you to be his heir." Alessandro met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and respect. "I am not my father," he said, his voice firm. "I do not want to be a part of this violence, this betrayal." Serafina nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I understand," she said, "and I offer you a choice.
You can walk away.
You can start a new life.
Or you can join me.
You can help me build something new, something better." Alessandro hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He looked at his uncle, at Marco Bellini, at the men who represented the old ways, the ways of violence and corruption. And then he looked at Serafina, at the woman who had dared to challenge them, the woman who offered him a different path. I will think about it," he said, finally. Serafina nodded. "Take your time," she said. "But know this. I am not going anywhere. I am here to stay. And I will not be defeated." She stood up, Luca moving with her, his presence a silent threat. She looked at the underbosses, her eyes blazing with defiance. "The game has changed, gentlemen," she said. "And I intend to win." The lioness had awakened. The roar was deafening, even in a silent room. They knew, as she turned to leave, that the old ways were crumbling. Chapter 10. Scars beneath the silk. The silk robe felt cool against Serafina's skin, a stark contrast to the heat that still lingered from the confrontation at the restaurant. She stood on the balcony of the apartment, overlooking the city, the lights twinkling like a million fallen stars. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and fresh, but the storm within her still raged. She had shown them her strength, her defiance, but she knew that it was only the beginning. The underbosses would not give up easily. They would retaliate, and she needed to be ready. Luca entered the room, his expression concerned. He had been on the phone again, gathering information, assessing the situation. "They are unsettled," he said, his voice low. "They did not expect you to fight back." Serafina nodded, her gaze fixed on the city below. "They underestimated me. They underestimated us," he corrected, his voice softening. He moved closer, standing beside her on the balcony, his shoulder brushing hers, sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, anger, determination, and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel exposed. Vulnerable." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her. "You are not vulnerable, Serafina," he said, his voice firm. "You are strong. You are brave. You are a queen. A queen." The word echoed in her mind, a reminder of the role she had chosen, of the responsibility she had taken upon herself. But beneath the silk, beneath the facade of strength, she felt the scars of the past, the wounds that Antonio had inflicted, the betrayals that had shaken her world. She turned away from him, her gaze drawn to the reflection in the glass, a ghostly image of herself, a woman she barely recognized. "I have scars," she said, her voice trembling. "Scars that you cannot see." He moved closer, his presence enveloping her, his scent a comforting anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He gently turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "I know," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "We all have scars, Serafina. Some are visible, some are hidden. But they do not define us. They do not diminish us. They make us who we are." He looked into her eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I see your scars, Serafina," he said. "And I see your strength. I see your beauty. I see everything." His words, his touch, his gaze, broke through the wall of grief and pain that had surrounded her. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear of release, of healing. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss that quickly deepened into something more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of understanding, of acceptance, of a love that was blossoming amidst the ruins of the past. She wrapped her arms around him, her body pressing against his, her silk robe sliding against his suit, the contrast of textures a subtle reminder of their different worlds, of the worlds they were now trying to bridge. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her inside, towards the bedroom. He laid her gently on the bed, his gaze never leaving hers. He began to undress her, his touch slow and deliberate, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and reverence. She reached out, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the scars that he carried, the visible reminders of his own past, of his own battles. "You have scars, too," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, his lips curving in a slight smile. "We all do," he repeated. He undressed, revealing his own body, a body honed by years of discipline and training, a body that bore the marks of violence, of survival. They came together, their bodies entwining, their scars meeting, their souls connecting. It was a moment of vulnerability, of surrender, of healing. It was a moment of love, of passion, of a new beginning. A beginning birthed not from silk and ease, but from scars and steel, from the willingness to expose every hidden part. Chapter 11. A Pact Made in Darkness. The pre-dawn light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room, painting the walls with streaks of gray and pale gold. Serafina lay tangled in the sheets, Luca's arm draped protectively across her waist, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the stillness. She felt a profound sense of peace, a tranquility she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. But it was a fragile peace, a fleeting moment of respite before the storm that she knew was coming. She gently eased herself out of Luca's embrace, careful not to wake him. She wrapped herself in the silk robe, the fabric cool against her skin, a reminder of the night before, of the vulnerability and the strength she had found in his arms. She walked to the window, looking out at the city, still shrouded in the pre-dawn gloom. Rome was waking up, its ancient streets slowly coming to life, oblivious to the dangerous game that was being played out within its walls. She thought of Antonio, of his betrayal, of his secrets. She thought of Alessandro, his son, the young man who held the key to the future of the Mancini and Rossi families. She thought of the underbosses, their greed and their ambition, their willingness to do anything to maintain their power. And she thought of Luca, the man who had stood by her, who had protected her, who had loved her, the man who had shown her her own strength, her own power. She knew that she could not do this alone. She needed him. She needed his strength, his knowledge, his unwavering loyalty. But she also needed something more. She needed his trust. She needed his partnership. She turned back to the bed, watching Luca as he slept. He looked younger in sleep, his face relaxed, his guard down. She saw the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the scars that marked his body, the visible reminders of his own battles, his own sacrifices. She knelt beside the bed, gently touching his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He stirred, his eyes opening, his gaze immediately focusing on her. "Serafina," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. She smiled, her heart filled with a tenderness she had never thought possible. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. He reached out, pulling her close, his embrace warm and comforting. He kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of love, of desire, of a connection that went beyond words. "We need to talk," she said, when they finally broke apart. He nodded, his expression serious. "I know." They sat on the edge of the bed, facing each other, the pre-dawn light illuminating their faces. "I cannot do this alone," she said, her voice firm. "I need you, Luca. Not just as my protector, but as my partner, my equal." He held her gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. "I am yours, Serafina," he said, his voice a promise. "In every way. Always. We need a pact," she continued. "A promise. Not just to each other, but to a new way of doing things. No more secrets. No more betrayals. No more violence." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "A new beginning," he said. "A different kind of family." She reached out, taking his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "We will expose Antonio's secrets," she said. "We will bring down the underbosses. We will offer Alessandro a choice. And then we will rebuild.
Together."
He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a surge of warmth through her. "We will," he affirmed. "And we will do it our way. Our way." The words resonated with her, a promise of a different future, a future where power was not synonymous with violence, where loyalty was not born of fear, where love was not a weakness, but a strength. They sealed their pact with a kiss, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of commitment, of trust, of a shared vision for the future. It was a pact made in darkness, in the pre-dawn hours, but it was a pact that would illuminate their path, that would guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. A pact that would transform not just them, but potentially an entire underworld steeped in tradition. Chapter 12. The Taste of Betrayal. The espresso was bitter, its taste mirroring the acrid feeling in Serafina's mouth. She sat at a small, secluded table in a cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of Trastevere, far from the prying eyes of the Mancini and Rossi families. Luca sat across from her, his expression grim, his dark eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. They had received information, a tip-off from one of Luca's contacts within the police force. The underbosses were planning a move, a coordinated attack to eliminate Serafina and seize control of the Mancini assets. And they were working with the Rossis. "It's Alessandro," Luca said, his voice low and urgent. "He betrayed us. He went back to his family." Serafina felt a cold wave of disappointment wash over her. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Alessandro would choose a different path, that he would reject the violence and corruption of his father's world. She had seen a flicker of goodness in him, a hint of a desire for something better. "I was wrong about him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Luca reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. "You saw the potential for good," he said, his voice firm. "But he made his choice. What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "We fight," he said. "We use what we have. We expose them all." He outlined his plan, a daring and dangerous maneuver that involved leaking information to the press, exposing the underbosses' crimes and their alliance with the Rossis. It was a risky gamble, one that could backfire spectacularly, but it was their only chance. "It's too dangerous," Serafina said, her voice filled with fear. "They will come after us. They will kill us." Luca smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Let them try," he said. "We will be ready." He had already set things in motion, contacting journalists, planting evidence, preparing for the storm that was about to break. He was a master strategist, a man who knew how to fight in the shadows, how to use information as a weapon. Serafina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. She had never known a man like him, a man who was both ruthless and compassionate, a man who could kill without hesitation and yet love with a fierce, unwavering intensity. I trust you, Luca," she said, her voice raw with emotion. He held her gaze, his eyes dark and unfathomable. "And I trust you, Serafina," he said, his voice a promise. "We will do this together." They finished their coffee, the silence between them filled with unspoken tension and anticipation. They left the cafe, stepping back into the bustling streets of Rome, a city that was about to become a battleground. As they walked, Serafina felt a hand on her arm, a firm grip that made her heart skip a beat. She turned, expecting to see one of the underboss's men, a threat made real. But it was Alessandro. He looked pale and shaken, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. Signora Mancini, he said, his voice trembling. I need to talk to you. Serafina looked at Luca, her eyes questioning. He nodded, his expression guarded. What is it, Alessandro? Serafina asked, her voice calm but wary. He looked around nervously, his gaze darting to the passing crowds. Not here, he said. Somewhere private. Serafina hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run, to get away from him. But there was something in his eyes, a desperation that made her pause. All right, she said, finally. But Luca comes with us. Alessandro nodded, his relief palpable. He led them to a nearby park, a secluded area surrounded by trees, a place where they could talk without being overheard. I made a mistake, Alessandro said, his voice raw with emotion. I went back to my family. I thought I could change them. But I was wrong. There they are planning to kill you. Serafina felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had known this, of course, but to hear it from Alessandro, from Antonio's son, made it all the more real. The taste of betrayal he served was bitter, but she held on to hope, a small flame in a growing storm. Chapter 13. Echoes in the Catacombs. The catacombs were a labyrinth of ancient tunnels and chambers, a hidden world beneath the bustling streets of Rome. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, a reminder of the countless souls who had been laid to rest here over the centuries. Alessandro had led them here, insisting that it was the only place they could talk safely, the only place where they would not be overheard. He had said that he had information, crucial information about the underboss's plans, about their alliance with the Rossis. Serafina walked beside Luca, her hand gripping his, her senses on high alert. She trusted Alessandro, or at least, she wanted to trust him, but she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were walking into a trap. The only light came from Luca's flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls, the ancient inscriptions, the occasional glimpse of a skull or bone. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. Why here, Alessandro? Serafina asked, her voice echoing in the narrow passageway. Why the catacombs? He glanced at her, his expression nervous, his eyes darting around the darkness. It's safe, he said. No one will find us here. No one will hear us. Except the dead, Luca murmured, his voice low and ominous. Alessandro stopped abruptly, his body tense. He turned to face them, his face pale in the flashlight beam. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice trembling. Something that you need to know. Serafina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that what he was about to say would change everything. What is it, Alessandro? She asked, her voice calm but firm. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. My father, he didn't just have secrets from you, Signor Mancini, he said. He had secrets from everyone. Secrets that could destroy us all. He explained, his voice halting and hesitant, that Antonio had been involved in something far bigger, far more dangerous than just the usual mafia business. He had been working with a shadowy organization, a group of powerful men who controlled not just Rome, but much of Italy, perhaps even beyond. They call themselves the Council, Alessandro said, his voice barely a whisper. And they are not to be trifled with. The Council? The word sent a shiver down Serafina's spine. She had heard whispers of this organization, rumors of its immense power, of its ruthless methods. She had always dismissed them as just stories, as legends of the underworld. And what does this council want? Luca asked, his voice hard. Alessandro looked at Serafina, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. They want you, he said. They want what Antonio left you. They want control.
Control.
The word echoed in the darkness, a chilling reminder of the forces that were arrayed against her. She was not just fighting the underbosses, not just the Rossis. She was fighting something far bigger, far more powerful, something that could crush her without a second thought. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the depths of the catacombs, a scraping sound, followed by footsteps. Someone was coming. Luca instantly switched off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. He pulled Serafina close, his arm protectively around her. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The footsteps grew closer, echoing in the narrow passageway. Serafina held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Luca's body tense beside her, ready to spring into action. The figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by shadows. They were armed, heavily armed. And they were not alone. Marco Bellini stood at the front, a cruel smile on his face. Beside him was Giovanni Rossi, his expression cold and calculating. "Looking for something, Signora Mancini?" Bellini asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Serafina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with defiance. "I should have known," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You were always a snake, Marco." "And you, my dear," he said, "were always a fool. You thought you could play with the big boys? You thought you could win?" Alessandro stood frozen with shock that washed away in moments as he moved to stand between the armed men and Serafina. He turned on the two men. "I brought her here to warn her." Giovanni moved forward with surprising speed, delivering a swift, hard strike to his nephew's head. He slumped, falling to the rough floor of the catacomb. Luca pushed Serafina behind him, his body shielding her from the threat. He was unarmed, but he was not defenseless. He was a trained fighter, a man who knew how to kill with his bare hands. But they were outnumbered, outgunned.
It was a hopeless situation. Or was it?
Serafina remembered something, a detail from Antonio's letters, a mention of a secret passage, a hidden escape route within the catacombs. A way out. "Luca," she whispered urgently. "There's another way.
Follow me."
She grabbed his hand, pulling him towards a narrow opening in the wall, a crack in the stone that was almost invisible in the darkness. It was a gamble, a desperate hope, but it was their only chance. The echoes of betrayal followed them into the darkness, a darkness that now offered not fear, but a slim chance of escape. Chapter 14. The Serpent's Kiss. The passage was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls closing in on Serafina, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. She could hear the shouts of the men behind them, their pursuit echoing through the catacombs, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Luca followed close behind, his hand gripping hers, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. He had retrieved a small, powerful flashlight from one of the fallen guards, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls, the occasional glimpse of a skull or bone. "Where are we going, Serafina?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "There's a hidden chamber," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Antonio mentioned it in his letters. A way out, a secret passage that leads to the outside. She didn't know if it was true, if the passage even existed, but she had to believe it. It was their only hope. They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinthine tunnels, the shouts of their pursuers growing fainter, then louder again, as the twists and turns of the catacombs played tricks with the sound. Suddenly, the passage opened into a larger chamber, a circular room with a high, vaulted ceiling. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in ancient inscriptions. "This is it," Serafina said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "This is the place." Luca examined the altar, his flashlight beam playing over the intricate carvings, the strange symbols. He found a lever, hidden beneath a carved serpent, its scales cold and smooth beneath his fingers. "The serpent's kiss," he murmured, a grim smile on his face. Antonio had a flair for the dramatic. He pulled the lever, and a section of the wall behind the altar slid open, revealing another passage, even narrower and darker than the one they had just come through. "Let's go," he said, his voice urgent. They squeezed through the opening, the wall closing behind them with a resounding thud, plunging them into darkness once more. They were trapped, sealed within the heart of the catacombs. But they were not alone. A soft voice echoed from the darkness, a voice that sent a chill down Serafina's spine. "Welcome, Signora Mancini," the voice said. "I have been expecting you." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, slender man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his appearance strangely out of place in the darkness and decay of the catacombs. "Who are you?" Serafina asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man smiled, a cold, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am the one you should have been afraid of all along," he said. "I am the council." He was not the council, of course, but a representative, a powerful figure who spoke with the authority of the shadowy organization that controlled Rome, that controlled much of Italy. "You have something that belongs to us, Signora Mancini," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Antonio's secrets. His legacy. We want it back." Serafina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with defiance. "It's not yours," she said, her voice firm. "It's mine, and I will not give it to you." The man laughed, a soft, chilling laugh that echoed through the chamber. "You have no choice, my dear," he said. "You are surrounded. You are outnumbered. You are outmatched." He gestured, and figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them, their faces hidden, their weapons drawn. They were the council's men, elite soldiers, trained killers. Serafina looked at Luca, her eyes filled with despair. It was over. They had lost. But Luca did not give up. He stepped forward, his body shielding Serafina from the threat, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You will have to go through me," he said, his voice hard and unwavering. The council's representative smiled, his eyes filled with amusement. "That, my friend," he said, "can be arranged." The kiss wasn't one of love or even hate, but of cold, calculating power. A power that seemed, in this moment, absolute. But in the eyes of the two facing it, something remained unbroken, a refusal, even in defeat. Chapter 15. Blood on the cobblestones. The explosion rocked the catacombs, sending dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and explosives, a stark contrast to the ancient, musty scent of the tunnels. Serafina coughed, shielding her face with her arm, her ears ringing from the blast. She looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Luca had acted quickly, instinctively. He had seen the council representative give a subtle signal, a nod to his men. He had known, with a chilling certainty, that they were about to be attacked, that their lives were about to end. He had pushed Serafina behind the altar, shielding her with his body, just as the explosives detonated. The blast had been powerful, but the altar had provided some protection, deflecting the worst of the force. They were alive, but they were trapped. The explosion had collapsed the passage they had come through, sealing them in the chamber. And the council's men were still out there, waiting for them. Luca checked Serafina for injuries, his hands gentle but firm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her head still spinning. I think so," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened?" "They were going to kill us," he said, his voice grim. I set off their explosives. It was the only chance. It was a desperate gamble, a move that could have easily killed them both. But it had bought them some time, a temporary reprieve. They were not out of danger, however. The council's representative was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, along with his men. And they would be looking for them, determined to finish what they had started. Luca helped Serafina to her feet, his arms supporting her. They needed to find another way out, a way to escape the catacombs before the council's men found them. They searched the chamber, their flashlight beam cutting through the dust and smoke, illuminating the ancient walls, the stone altar, the debris from the explosion. They found another passage, hidden behind a tapestry depicting a scene of ancient Roman life. It was narrow and dark, but it was their only hope. They entered the passage, moving quickly and quietly, their senses on high alert. They could hear the sounds of their pursuers, their voices echoing through the tunnels, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The passage led them through a maze of tunnels, twisting and turning, descending deeper and deeper into the earth. They had no idea where they were going, but they had to keep moving to stay ahead of their pursuers. Suddenly, the passage opened into a large, open space, a vast cavern beneath the city. The air was fresh and cool, and they could hear the sound of running water. They had reached the ancient Roman sewer system, a network of tunnels and waterways that ran beneath the streets of Rome. It was a dangerous place, filled with rats and disease, but it was also a way out, a way to escape the catacombs. They followed the waterway, moving quickly through the darkness, their footsteps splashing in the shallow water. They could hear the sounds of the city above them, the rumble of traffic, the shouts of vendors, the everyday sounds of life, a stark contrast to the darkness and danger of the world below. Finally, they reached a grate, a metal barrier that separated the sewer system from the outside world. Luca tried to lift it, but it was heavy and rusted shut. He used a piece of debris, a broken piece of stone, to pry it open, the metal screeching in protest. He finally managed to lift it, creating a small opening, just big enough for them to squeeze through. They emerged from the sewer, blinking in the bright sunlight, their clothes soaked and dirty, their bodies covered in grime. They were on a quiet side street, a narrow cobblestone alleyway far from the bustling center of Rome. They had escaped the catacombs, but they were not safe yet. The council was still out there, and they would be looking for them. They needed to disappear, to go to ground, to find a safe place to regroup and plan their next move. They needed to survive. The blood on the cobblestones, both theirs and that of their enemies, was a testament to the fight, a fight that was far from over. Chapter 16. Masks and Miracles. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a quiet residential neighborhood, far from the center of Rome and the prying eyes of the council. It was one of Luca's many bolt holes, a place he had prepared for emergencies, for situations just like this. It was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable, with everything they needed to survive: food, water, medical supplies, and a secure communication system. Serafina had showered, washing away the grime and the stench of the catacombs, changing into clean clothes that Luca had provided. She felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she also felt a renewed sense of determination. They had survived. They had escaped. And they would fight back. Luca was on the phone, speaking in rapid Italian, his voice low and urgent. He was contacting his network, gathering information, assessing the situation. He was a man of resources, a man who knew how to operate in the shadows. He finished his call, his expression grim. "The council is looking for us," he said. "They have put out a kill order. They are offering a substantial reward for our capture or our deaths." Serafina felt a chill run down her spine. They were hunted, marked for death. But she would not give up. She would not be intimidated. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Luca outlined his plan, a daring and audacious maneuver that involved exposing the council to the world, revealing their crimes, their corruption, their control over Italian society.
"It's our only chance," he said.
"We need to turn the tables on them. We need to make them the hunted." It was a risky gamble, one that could easily backfire, but it was their only option. They needed to strike back, to fight fire with fire. They spent the next few days preparing, gathering evidence, contacting journalists, building their case against the council. It was a painstaking process, requiring meticulous attention to detail, a constant awareness of the danger they were in. They worked together, seamlessly, their skills complementing each other. Serafina's knowledge of Antonio's secrets, her understanding of the inner workings of the Mancini family, combined with Luca's network of contacts, his strategic mind, his ability to operate in the shadows, made them a formidable team. But it was more than just a partnership. It was a bond, a connection forged in the fires of adversity, strengthened by shared danger, by mutual trust, by a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of the past. One evening, as they were reviewing documents, Serafina paused, her gaze drawn to a small, ornate box on the table. It was Antonio's box, the one that had contained his letters to Isabella Rossi. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, beneath the letters, was a hidden compartment. And within that compartment was a single object, a mask. It was a beautiful mask, crafted from silver and inlaid with precious stones, a work of art. But it was also a symbol, a representation of the hidden world of the council, of the secrets and lies that had shaped her life. She held the mask in her hands, her fingers tracing the intricate details, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin.
What is it?
Luca asked, his voice curious. It's a symbol, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A symbol of everything we are fighting against. He looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. And a reminder, he said, of what we are fighting for. They were fighting for a future free from the shadows, free from the control of the council, free from the violence and corruption that had plagued their lives. They were fighting for a new beginning, a different kind of world. And they would use every weapon at their disposal, even the masks of their enemies, to achieve their goal. It would take a miracle, they both knew, but miracles, like masks, could sometimes hide the truth of what lay beneath. Chapter 17. The Falcon's Flight. The press conference was held in a small, independent theater, far from the glitz and glamour of the usual media venues. It was a deliberate choice, a signal that this was not about spectacle, but about truth. Serafina stood on the stage, Luca by her side, his presence a silent source of strength and support. The room was packed with journalists, their faces eager, their cameras flashing, their microphones poised to capture every word. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple but elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the silver mask she held in her hand, the mask she had found in Antonio's box, the symbol of the council's power and corruption. She began to speak, her voice calm and measured, her Italian flawless. She told her story, the story of Antonio's betrayal, of the underboss's greed, of the Rossi's alliance, of the council's control. She presented the evidence, the documents, the letters, the recordings, the proof of the council's crimes, their corruption, their manipulation of Italian society. She named names, exposing the powerful men who had operated in the shadows for decades, the men who had thought themselves untouchable. The journalists were stunned, their initial skepticism quickly replaced by shock and disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before, a woman daring to challenge the most powerful organization in Italy, a woman risking her life to expose the truth. As she spoke, Luca projected images onto a large screen behind her, showing the faces of the council members, their connections to organized crime, their involvement in political scandals, their history of violence and intimidation. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The council's carefully constructed facade of respectability was crumbling before their eyes. Suddenly, the doors of the theater burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. They were the council's men, sent to silence Serafina, to stop her from revealing their secrets. Chaos erupted in the room, journalists scrambling for cover, cameras flashing, screams filling the air. Luca reacted instantly, pulling Serafina behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew a weapon, a small, concealable pistol, and fired, taking down one of the attackers. A gunfight ensued, the theater echoing with the sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Luca fought with the skill and ferocity of a trained warrior, protecting Serafina, taking down the attackers one by one. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. It was a desperate situation. Then, something unexpected happened. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces also masked, but their movements different, their purpose clear. They were not the council's men. They were Alessandro's men. He had chosen his side. He had chosen to fight against his family, against the council, against the violence and corruption that had defined his life. He joined the fight, his weapon blazing, his actions speaking louder than words. He was fighting for a new future, a different kind of legacy. Together, Luca and Alessandro, and the men loyal to them drove back the attack. The battle raged on, then suddenly subsided. The remaining council enforcers, beaten, bloodied, and realizing that their mission had failed, retreated. Serafina stood amidst the chaos, her heart pounding, her body trembling, but her spirit unbroken. She had faced death, and she had survived. She had exposed the council, and she had won. She looked at Luca, his face covered in sweat and grime, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his eyes blazing with triumph. She looked at Alessandro, his expression a mixture of relief and determination, his future uncertain, but his path clear. The falcon, a symbol of power and freedom, had taken flight. The council's control was broken. The truth was out, and a new era had begun. The flight, however, had been through a storm, and the landing was yet to be seen. Chapter 18. Ashes and Diamonds. The aftermath of the press conference was a whirlwind of activity. The media went into a frenzy, the story dominating headlines around the world. The authorities launched investigations, arrests were made, and the council's vast network of power and influence began to unravel. Serafina and Luca were hailed as heroes, their courage and determination praised by the public, their actions sparking a wave of hope and change across Italy. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high. Lives had been lost, including some of Alessandro's men, loyal soldiers who had sacrificed everything for a better future. And the scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, would remain. Serafina found herself in a strange new world. The palazzo, once Antonio's domain and then her gilded cage, was now empty, a silent monument to the past. She had no desire to return there, to live among the ghosts of her former life. She had moved into Luca's apartment, the small, discreet bolt hole that had become their sanctuary, their home. It was a simple place, but it was filled with warmth and love, a stark contrast to the cold opulence of the Mancini mansion. One evening, as they were sitting on the balcony, overlooking the city, Serafina turned to Luca, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty.
What now?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happens to us? Luca took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. We rebuild, he said, his voice firm. We create something new, something better. He had plans, ideas for a different kind of future, a future where power was not synonymous with violence, where loyalty was not born of fear, where love was not a weakness, but a strength. He wanted to use the Mancini resources, the wealth and influence that Antonio had accumulated through illegal means, to do good, to help people, to build a more just and equitable society. He wanted to create a foundation, a charitable organization that would support education, healthcare, and social justice initiatives across Italy. Serafina listened, her heart filled with hope and admiration. She had always known that Luca was a good man, a man of integrity, despite his past, despite his association with the dark world of the mafia. And what about Alessandro? She asked, her voice hesitant. Luca's expression softened. He has a choice to make, he said. He can walk away, start a new life, free from the shadows of his family. Or he can join us. He can help us build this new future. Serafina nodded, her gaze drawn to the city lights twinkling in the darkness. She thought of Alessandro, of his courage, of his willingness to betray his family, to fight for what was right. She hoped that he would choose the right path, that he would find redemption and peace. And what about you? She asked, turning back to Luca, her eyes searching his. What do you want, Luca? He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes. I want you, Serafina, he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a family with you. A real family, built on love and trust, not on secrets and lies. His words, his touch, his gaze, sent a wave of emotion through her. She leaned in, her lips meeting his, a kiss that spoke of love, of commitment, of a shared future. The ashes of the past, the diamonds of the future, now mingled. They had burned it all down, the old life, the old ways. What would rise? They did not fully know. Chapter 19. A Crown of Thorns. The trial was a media circus, a spectacle that captivated the nation. The members of the council, the underbosses, the corrupt politicians, and the business tycoons who had colluded with them were all brought to justice, their crimes exposed, their power shattered. Serafina was called to testify, her testimony crucial to the prosecution's case. She spoke with courage and conviction, her voice unwavering, her eyes filled with determination. She told her story, the story of Antonio's betrayal, of the violence and corruption that had defined her life, of the fight for a new future. She faced her enemies, the men who had tried to kill her, the men who had underestimated her, the men who had thought she was just a weak, grieving widow. She saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that their reign of terror was over. Luca was there, always by her side, his presence a silent source of strength and support. He, too, testified, his testimony corroborating Serafina's, his knowledge of the inner workings of the council proving invaluable to the prosecution. Alessandro also testified, his testimony a powerful indictment of his family, of the council, of the old ways. He had chosen his side, and he had chosen wisely. He was a key witness, his words carrying the weight of a reformed insider, a prodigal son returned. The trial lasted for weeks, the evidence presented overwhelming, the outcome inevitable. The defendants were found guilty, sentenced to long prison terms, their power and influence stripped away. Justice was served, but it was not a cause for celebration. The trial had reopened old wounds, brought back painful memories, exposed the dark underbelly of Italian society. Serafina felt exhausted, drained, both physically and emotionally. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, the cost too high. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, she found herself standing on the balcony of their apartment, overlooking the city. The lights of Rome twinkled below, a beautiful panorama that belied the darkness that had lurked beneath its surface. Luca came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, his presence a comforting warmth. "It's almost over," he said, his voice low and soothing. Serafina nodded, her gaze fixed on the city below. "But it will never be truly over, will it?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The scars, they remain." He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "The scars are a reminder," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "A reminder of what we have overcome. A reminder of what we are fighting for." He kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of love, of understanding, of a shared journey through darkness and into light. "We have a choice, Serafina," he said, his eyes searching hers. "We can let the past define us, or we can create our own future. We can wear the crown of thorns, or we can forge a new crown, a crown of hope, a crown of love, a crown of thorns." The image resonated with her, a symbol of suffering, of sacrifice, but also of redemption, of rebirth. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. She had found her strength, her power, not in the shadows of the mafia, but in the light of his love, in the promise of a new future. The crown she would wear was not yet fully formed, but she knew, with a certainty that warmed her from the inside out, that it would not be one of thorns alone. Chapter 20. The Queen's Gambit. The villa overlooked the sea, a beautiful, secluded haven far from the noise and chaos of Rome. It was Serafina's new home, a place she had chosen, a place where she could finally breathe, where she could finally heal, where she could finally begin to build a new life. It was not a palace, not a symbol of power and wealth, but a home, a place of warmth and love, a place where she could be herself, Serafina, not just the Mancini widow, not just the queen who had brought down the council. Luca was there, of course. He was always there, her constant companion, her lover, her partner, her rock. They had built this new life together, brick by brick, their love and trust forming the foundation, their shared vision of the future guiding their every step. Alessandro was also there, a frequent visitor, a part of their extended family. He had chosen to walk away from the darkness of his past, to embrace a new life, a life of purpose and meaning. He was working with Luca, helping to build the foundation, using his knowledge and skills to do good, to make a difference. The foundation was thriving, a beacon of hope and change, supporting education, healthcare, and social justice initiatives across Italy. Serafina and Luca were working tirelessly, channeling their energy, their resources, their passion into making a positive impact on the world. They had faced their enemies, they had exposed their secrets, they had brought them to justice. They had survived, they had triumphed, and they had emerged stronger, more determined, more in love than ever before. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the sea, Serafina and Luca stood on the terrace of the villa, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with peace and contentment. "We did it," Serafina said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "We actually did it." Luca smiled, his eyes twinkling in the fading light. "We did," he affirmed. "We changed the world." "Not the whole world," she corrected, her voice soft. "But our world. Our little corner of it." He kissed her, a long, slow, passionate kiss that spoke of love, of commitment, of a shared future. "And that's enough," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "That's more than enough." Serafina looked out at the sea, the waves gently lapping against the shore, the sky ablaze with color. She thought of all that she had been through, of all that she had lost, of all that she had gained. She had been a wife, a widow, a pawn, a queen. She had been a victim, a survivor, a fighter, a lover. She had been broken, and she had been healed. She had been lost, and she had been found. She had played the game, the dangerous game of power and intrigue, and she had won. But her victory was not about power, not about wealth, not about revenge. It was about love, about justice, about hope, about a new beginning. It was the Queen's Gambit, a risky, daring move that had changed everything. She had sacrificed much, but in doing so, she had gained everything that truly mattered. She had offered up the pieces of her old life, and in return, had claimed a future she had never dared to dream of. She had found peace. She had found happiness. She had found love. Epilogue. 5 years later. The villa was filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, the warmth of family and friends. It was a celebration, a gathering to mark the 5th anniversary of the foundation, the organization that Serafina and Luca had built together, the legacy they were creating for future generations. Serafina stood on the terrace, overlooking the sea, her arm wrapped around Luca's waist, his hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. She was pregnant, expecting their first child, a symbol of their love, of their hope, of their new beginning. Alessandro was there, his arm around a beautiful young woman, his wife, a lawyer who worked with the foundation, fighting for justice and equality. He had found love, he had found happiness, he had found his purpose. The guests were a mix of old friends and new, people who had supported them through their journey, people who believed in their vision, people who were working with them to build a better world. There were journalists, politicians, activists, artists, people from all walks of life, united by a common goal, to make a difference, to create a more just and equitable society. Serafina looked around at the gathering, her heart filled with gratitude and joy. She had come a long way from the grieving widow, the silent, obedient mafia wife, the pawn in a dangerous game. She had found her voice, her strength, her power. She had become a leader, an inspiration, a force for change. She had found love, true love, a love that had sustained her through the darkest of times, a love that had given her the courage to fight, to survive, to triumph. She had built a family, a real family, not based on blood or tradition, but on love and trust, on shared values and a common purpose. She had created a legacy of hope, of change, of a better future for generations to come. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the sea, Serafina smiled, her eyes shining with happiness. She had played the Queen's Gambit, and she had won. But her victory was not just her own. It was a victory for everyone who believed in a better world, a victory for love, for justice, for hope. It was a victory for the future. And she knew that, come what may, that her life, her purpose, was full. The Queen had not just survived, she had thrived.